Hey guys, tonight we drift into the flickering torchlight of marble corridors where whispers echo louder than footsteps. The air smells of incense and sweat, and you already sense the tension on isn't in safe hands tonight. Because our journey begins with rulers so bizarre, so wildly unpredictable, that you probably won't survive this if you ever had to live under them. Imagine a government where the laws change with your leader's mood, and the mood shifts faster than TikTok trends. That's the world you're walking into. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Share it down below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slip past marble pillars and into a palace where the Emperor Ice and Tea just ruling Rome. He's staging his own fever dream. Caligula, whose real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, begins as a beloved young emperor. At first, the Romans adore him, calling him Little Boots, a nickname from his childhood when he tagged along with his father's soldiers in tiny armor. Cute, right? But like all cute stories, this one curdles fast. Picture this. You're at a royal banquet. Wine flows, musicians play, and suddenly the emperor leans back and asks everyone to worship him as a god. Not as a figure of speech, he literally demands divine worship. Historians still argue whether Caligula truly believed in his own divinity, or if he was just leaning into shock value for control. Either way, you're stuck pretending to pray while he grins, knowing he could end you with a wave. And if that's not unnerving enough, glance across the table. There's a horse's stable being discussed as a senate seat. Caligula adored his horse Incitatus so much that he dressed it in jewels, built it a marble stall, and depending on which ancient gossip you trust, planned to make it a consul. Was it satire aimed at the useless senators? Was it genuine madness? Scholars disagree, but you still find yourself imagining the awkward silence in a Senate chamber with a neighing politician. Here's a little fringe detail that docenty always make the textbooks. Some accounts claim Caligula ordered soldiers to collect seashells during his campaign against Neptune, the god of the sea. You can picture the legionaries trudging on the beach with baskets, muttering like kids forced into a school play. A military triumph for seashells, history's most absurd war trophy. The emperor's appetite for humiliation doesn't stop at military pageantry. You walk past gardens where statues of gods now, where Caligula's own face chiseled into marble. It's like a cosmic prank, replacing Jupiter with your boss. And in the palace, his sisters, especially Drusilla, aren't just honored, they're tangled into whispered scandals. Some Roman writers hint at incestuous relationships, though historians still argue whether these were slandered by his enemies or disturbing truths. Either way, you'd avoid making eye contact at family dinners. By now, the palace feels less like a government headquarters and more like a carnival, where the rides are powered by fear. Caligula stages gladiatorial games, but unlike traditional spectacles, he sometimes tosses entire sections of the audience into the arena for amusement. Imagine watching Netflix when suddenly the screen decides to eat you. The unpredictability is what terrifies. No logic, no pattern, just whimsy turned lethal. You step outside into Rome itself. At first glance, the city seems unchanged. Vendors sell olives. Children chase dogs in the forum, but underneath, the empire trembles. Governors fear surprise visits, senators grovel to survive, and the people whisper about omens. Remember, this is a culture where birds' flight patterns decide destinies. And with Caligula, every day feels like the sky could darken in minutes. One night, as torches flicker and shadows dance on walls, Caligula announces he'll march east to fight the Parthians. Everyone braces for war. Instead, he detours, throws seaside feasts, and declares victory after capturing seashells. Soldiers laugh nervously, but the empire bleeds money and morale. It's the ancient equivalent of announcing a moon landing and delivering a backyard barbecue. You might chuckle, after all, history written from a safe distance often sounds like satire. But imagine living under a man who wakes up with the power of life and death over you. A man whose morning mood swing might send you to execution or elevate your donkey to priesthood. That's the reality Roman citizens endured. And it all ends in predictable tragedy. Assassins, his own guards, finally strike. cutting him down in a palace corridor. Yet even in death, Caligula's carnival lingers. Romans debate whether to erase him from memory or preserve his chaos as a warning. Historians still argue, was he truly insane, or was he a political genius who cloaked cruelty in theatrical absurdity? You'll never know, but as you step out of that palace, you feel the lingering tension, as if the laughter and terror echo in the marble forever. You follow a narrow, winding road through the Belgian countryside. The autumn air crisp and tinged with smoke from distant chimneys. The forests seem quiet, almost too quiet, and then you approach a palace where the grandeur hides a grim reality. Leopold II, King of Belgium, presides not just over his European kingdom, but over an entire African colony, treated as his private property. You probably won. To survive long here without confronting the stark contrast between opulence and oppression, monarch whose ambition for wealth eclipsed any moral compass. Leopold begins his reign seemingly as a cultured, progressive European king, interested in the arts, politics, and philanthropy. Yet beneath the veneer, the Congo Free State exists as his personal venture, exploiting resources and people with ruthless efficiency. Historians still argue how much of Leopold's European image was deliberate propaganda versus genuine interest in the arts and modernization, but the evidence from Congo tells a much darker story. You tread carefully through grand halls adorned with tapestries and marble, aware that wealth often masks horrors. The quirky detail: Leopold reportedly had a fascination with exotic animals and displays of civilized African culture, commissioning elaborate exhibitions for European audiences. You can almost imagine courtiers dressing up performers or animals for dinner parties, an absurd spectacle that belied the suffering behind the curtain. You learn quickly that the Congolese were subjected to forced labor, brutal punishments, and systematic exploitation, all orchestrated to maximize rubber and ivory extraction. Entire villages were terrorized into compliance, and any failure to meet quotas could result in horrific reprisals. Scholars still debate the exact death toll, but estimates are staggering, and the human cost is undeniable. You shudder, imagining the contrast between Leopold's gilded European palace and the suffering thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, Leopold's personal life in Belgium is oddly mundane. He enjoys horseback riding, lavish dinners, and attending concerts. He's often oblivious or indifferent to the atrocities under his rule. Fringe detail: some reports suggest he maintained secret tunnels and hidden rooms in his palaces, ostensibly for privacy, though rumors hinted at clandestine planning of colonial administration. King literally hiding his deeds behind walls. Yet there's strategy here, if cold and calculating. Leopold uses treaties, manipulates international opinion, and presents himself as a humanitarian, masking the extraction and terror of the Congo. Historians still argue whether Europe's delayed intervention was due to ignorance, complicity, or the sheer audacity of Leopold's political maneuvering. You note the eerie efficiency. A single monarch, backed by bureaucracy and deceit, shaping an entire continent's fate for personal gain. Walking through the gardens, you see statues commemorating exploration and civilization, and you can't help but feel the chilling irony. The very images of progress serve to whitewash the violence that sustained it. As the sun dips below the horizon, shadows stretch across the lawns, echoing the far-reaching consequences of one man's unchecked ambition. Leopold II's reign is a study in contrasts: a cultured, wealthy king on one side and a ruthless exploiter of human lives on the other. You step away from the palace gates, carrying with you the uncomfortable truth that sometimes history's most elegant facades conceal the deepest horrors. You traverse the sun-baked plains of Hungary in the early 14th century, the air shimmering with heat and dust swirling from distant herds. The royal palace rises before you, imposing yet strangely empty, much like the kingdom's leadership under Ludwig of Hungary. You probably want to survive a full day here without noticing a peculiar absenteeism. The king is present in title, but absent in spirit, leaving the kingdom to teeter precariously while he chases ambitions elsewhere. Ludwig begins as a capable young ruler, ambitious and eager to prove himself, yet you quickly notice his attention is elsewhere: crusades, foreign alliances, and campaigns that draw him far from home. Historians still argue whether Ludwig's extended absences were reckless negligence or a strategic attempt to secure Hungary's influence abroad. You shuffle through quiet corridors past empty council chambers, sensing a monarchy that survives more by legacy than by active governance. The quirky detail? Ludwig reportedly had a fascination with exotic relics from his travels, including weapons, religious artifacts, and even live falcons shipped from distant lands. You imagine him walking through corridors cluttered with treasures, debating the merits of one falcon's plumage over another while the kingdom languishes? Meanwhile, the nobility and local administrators fill the vacuum of power. Corruption, local uprisings, and internal disputes simmer unchecked, forcing advisors to govern in the king's absence. Ludwig's mind is focused on foreign battles, leaving the domestic front fragile. Historians still argue whether these absentee reigns weakened Hungary irreparably, or whether loyal ministers stabilized the realm effectively. You notice the tension in the air as courtiers whisper, trying to balance obedience with survival, acutely aware that the king is both distant and unpredictable. In personal matters, Ludwig displays a curious mix of piety and bravado. He invests in grand ceremonies for his foreign conquests and seeks alliances with distant courts, yet rarely witnesses the consequences of his political decisions firsthand. Fringe detail? Some reports suggest he maintained a personal miniature army of exotic mercenaries from his travels, training them in the palace gardens for display rather than actual combat. You step cautiously around them, half expecting one to charge unexpectedly. And yet Ludwig's legacy is a complicated one. While his absence frustrates historians and citizens alike, he manages to leave a mark through strategic marriages, alliances, and cultural exchanges with other European courts. Historians still argue whether the benefits outweigh the costs of his neglect. But the narrative of a kingdom left largely to itself under a wandering monarch is striking. As you leave the palace halls, the sun sets over the Hungarian plains, casting long shadows that seem to stretch across the history of a king who ruled from afar. You feel the tension between his ambition and absence, a lesson in how a crown alone does not make a strong ruler. You step into the dusky streets, realizing that leadership requires presence, not just titles, and that kingdoms often bear the brunt of absentee kings like Ludwig. You meander along the sunlit harbors of 16th century Naples, the scent of salt and fried fish mingling in the warm air, and find yourself in the presence of Ferdinand I, King of Naples, though the word king feels almost ironic. You probably won't survive a day trying to rely on him for governance. This is a monarch whose idea of ruling is more lays and feasts than strategy and diplomacy. Ferdinand begins as a young, educated ruler, groomed to manage a Mediterranean kingdom of complex politics, but his interests diverge sharply from responsibility. You notice the royal entourage scurrying to manage state affairs, while Ferdinand strolls along the docks, chatting with fishermen or enjoying elaborate feasts. Historians still argue whether his neglect was uniquely detrimental or whether the kingdom, his ministers skillfully maintained order despite his whims. You step carefully across palace floors that echo with empty decrees and unpaid taxes, feeling the disconnect between crown and governance. The quirky detail. Ferdinand reportedly enjoyed fishing more than any court ceremony. Tales circulate that he would spend entire days on the water, nets dangling, oblivious to diplomatic crises awaiting him in the palace. You imagine courtiers waiting at council meetings, glancing at empty chairs, the king somewhere else, serenely catching fish and ignoring the state's slow unraveling. Yet Naples is not entirely free from turbulence. Foreign powers eye the kingdom greedily, internal factions plot quietly, peasants chafe under rising taxes and inconsistent law enforcement. Ferdinand's ministers handle crises as best they can, often improvising while trying not to attract royal attention. Historians still argue whether Naples' survival during his reign is a testament to bureaucratic skill or sheer luck. You wander through a quiet chamber where decrees pile up unread, the air heavy with ink, dust, and missed opportunities. And then there's the king's personal indulgence. Ferdinand loves feasting music, in the company of the common people, sometimes inviting townsfolk into palace gardens for informal banquets. Fringe detail? He reportedly staged elaborate drinking contests with visiting nobles, where the winner received little more than his fleeting approval and an embarrassing public display. You wince at the thought, noting how courtly life sometimes bends to entertain his whims rather than serve governance. Despite his apparent neglect, Ferdinand's reign is oddly stable in certain respects. Naples continues to function, trade persists, diplomatic ties are maintained, though often at the cost of overburdening loyal ministers and distant allies. Historians still argue whether this stability masks incompetence or reveals an unusual delegation strategy. You note the tension. A kingdom hanging between efficient bureaucracy and the whims of a king who prefers leisure to leadership. By evening, the sun dips behind distant hills, and the harbor glows orange against the water. Ferdinand strolls casually along the docks, nets in hand, laughing with sailors, unaware of the kingdom's anxieties. You step back, feeling the absurd charm and quiet peril of a reign conducted mostly at leisure. Naples endures. But you can't help wondering how long any kingdom can survive under a ruler more enamored with fishing than ruling. You wander through the lush, tropical streets of 19th-century Brazil, the scent of jacaranda flowers mixing with the faint tank of ink from government offices. Pedro II, the emperor, sits quietly in his study, surrounded by books, gadgets, and manuscripts. You probably won't survive observing his reign without noticing a paradox, a brilliant, cultured monarch whose disinterest in politics allows the wheels of empire to turn with surprising autonomy. Pedro begins as a young boy emperor, ascending the throne after a coup, deposing his father. You notice immediately that he is thoughtful, deeply intellectual, and curious about science, astronomy, and literature. Historians still argue whether his passion for study compromised his political effectiveness, or whether his delegation of authority allowed Brazil to flourish in ways a micromanaging ruler might have jeopardized. You follow him through his personal library, the air thick with the musty scent of parchment and candle smoke. The quirky detail? Pedro reportedly experimented with telegraphs and even dabbled in early photography, often leaving the government to attend to his inventions. You imagine courtiers patiently waiting as the emperor fusses with a telescope, oblivious to meetings scheduled hours ago. His fascination with gadgets sometimes draws laughter from visitors. Though there's always a tinge of anxiety after all, someone still has to run the empire. Pedro is widely respected for his intellect and moral compass. He abolishes slavery in Brazil, modernizes infrastructure, and strengthens education. Yet much of this is accomplished through trusted ministers and advisors. Historians still argue whether Pedro's hands-off style was visionary delegation or subtle abdication of responsibility. You wander the palace gardens, lined with exotic flora, imagining the emperor strolling quietly, immersed in a book, while ministers negotiate treaties in distant chambers. And there's his personal life, surprisingly relatable. Pedro reportedly enjoyed music, sketching, and conversing with scientists, displaying curiosity about almost every corner of human knowledge, fringe detail. He collected exotic insects and sometimes held small, informal lectures in the palace, as though conducting a private academy for anyone who wished to attend. You imagine the courtiers, bemused but inspired, quietly tiptoeing among pinned butterflies and detailed charts. Yet even a thoughtful ruler cannot escape the world's pressures. Political tensions, social unrest, and economic challenges occasionally demand Pedro's attention. Still, he approaches these with measured calm, often leaving advisors to implement practical solutions, while he focuses on study and personal curiosity. Historians still argue whether this combination of intellect and detachment allowed Brazil to prosper, or left certain crises unaddressed. By evening, the warm Brazilian light filters through tall windows, illuminating Pedro's contemplative expression as he reads by candlelight. You step back, noting the strange comfort in a reign conducted more in the mind than on the battlefield. Here is a king who rules not through spectacle or terror, but through quiet wisdom, curiosity, and a trust in the machinery of governance. And as you leave the study, the rustle of turning pages lingers in the air, subtle reminder that not all dysfunctional monarchs are defined by chaosm, are defined by brilliance cloaked in gentle neglect. You find yourself in the echoing marble halls of 20th century Romania, the cold stone pressing against your senses, and there sits Michael I, the young king caught between tradition, war, and the relentless march of modernity. You probably won't survive long here without sensing the impossible weight of his crown, a symbol of authority rendered almost meaningless by global conflict, internal politics, and relentless historical tides. Michael begins as a boy king, ascending the throne under extraordinary circumstances. At first, he is a figurehead, his decisions constrained by regents and foreign powers. Historians still argue whether his early reign demonstrated genuine political acumen, or whether he was entirely manipulated by advisors and circumstance. You watch him stride down the long corridors, regal posture belying the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. A young monarch forced to act older than his years. The quirky detail? Michael reportedly had a fascination with cars and motorcycles, often sneaking rides through palace gardens when officials weren't looking. You picture the young king, helmet askew, revving engines while ministers scramble to maintain decorum. It's a small rebellion, almost endearing, in a life otherwise dictated by the demands of state and war. Yet the kingdom itself teeters on chaos. Romania is caught between World War II alliances, internal factions, and shifting borders. Michael must navigate treacherous waters, including his infamous forced abdication by the communist regime. He glimpsed documents and telegrams, each word potentially carrying life-altering consequences for the boy king and his people. Historians still argue whether his resistance against Nazi influence demonstrated genuine courage or was a calculated gamble that happened to succeed. In quieter moments, Michael shows remarkable resolve and intelligence, secretly planning actions that could alter the course of the country. Fringe detail. He reportedly carried a small notebook during exile, meticulously recording events and reflections, a testament to a mind that remained alert despite being stripped of power. You notice how even in banishment, the aura of monarchy lingers in his movements, gestures, and careful diplomacy. His personal life, like his reign, is marked by tension between public expectation and private desire. He marries, raises a family, and attempts to carve out a semblance of normalcy while exiled. Yet the shadow of kingship never fully lifts. Historians still argue how much of Michael's legacy lies in his actions as monarch versus his symbolic role as a beacon of resistance. By evening, as you step through the palace gates one last time, you feel the echo of history pressing softly against your back. Michael's reign is a study in resilience, a king navigating the impossible, embodying dignity in the face of overwhelming circumstance. You walk away, carrying the sense of a monarchy defined not by chaos, whimsy, or terror, but by quiet perseverance. A reminder that even dysfunctional kings can leave a legacy of courage, reflection, and subtle influence. You pause at the edge of this long historical journey, the shadows of empires and palaces fading into the quiet of your mind. Let your imagination drift among the corridors, gardens, and courts you've traversed tonight. The flickering torchlight in Rome, the frozen halls of Moscow, the mist-shrouded Bavarian mountains, the gilded gardens of England, and the tropical sun of Brazil. Each king, in their own way, shows the delicate balance between human frailty and the weight of sovereignty, a reminder that power magnifies both virtue and folly.
Ow!
Allow your senses to settle. Hear the soft echo of footsteps on stone floors, the rustle of manuscripts, the quiet murmur of distant fountains. In this gentle twilight, the tension of tyrants, the whimsy of dreamers, and the resilience of thoughtful rulers recede, leaving only calm. Imagine the air around you softening, each historical shadow becoming a whisper, a memory fading into comfort. Your breath slows, and the world of crowns and chaos dissolves into the hush of night. the lingering stories settling into a peaceful rhythm. Let the kingdoms drift away, the kings resting in the folds of time. While you rest here, safe and undisturbed. Let the weight of history dissolve into a soft hum, a lullaby of lessons learned and marvels observed. Slowly, your thoughts untangle from plots, conspiracies, and crowns, replaced by the gentle warmth of reflection. The world is vast, history complex, but here, in this quiet moment, all that remains is the calm resonance of stories told and the gentle promise of sleep. You wander further down the marble roads of Rome, the scent of smoke already prickling your nostrils. Somewhere in the distance, laughter mingles with cries, and you realize you've stumbled into one of the most infamous nights in history. The city of Rome is on fire, and at its center sits an emperor who doesn't quite know whether he's supposed to lead or to perform. This, of course, is Nero, the man remembered less for ruling and more for allegedly fiddling while his capital went up in flames. Now, quick correction, violins weren't invented yet, so the image of Nero with a fiddle is pure medieval rumor. What he did have was a cithara, a kind of lyre. And historians still argue whether Nero was actually strumming anything at all during the Great Fire of 64 CE. Some say he was far away when it started. Others say he performed a tragic poem about the destruction of Troy as flames consumed Rome. Either way, the picture sticks. Rome collapses, and Nero casts himself as the star of his own opera. You make your way through the streets, and it's chaos. Families clutching whatever they can carry, children screaming, the heat so fierce you can feel your eyebrows singe. 6 days of fire reduce huge swaths of the city to ash, and yet when the embers cool, Nero Santi rebuild Rome with solemn dignity. He sees an opportunity to create his dream project. The Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Imagine a palace so lavish, it includes a rotating dining room ceiling that sprinkles rose petals on guests. Sit there choking politely while petals rain down like confetti at a wedding you didn't RSVP to. Inside this palace, frescoes glow with colors so vivid they still inspire Renaissance painters centuries later. There's a man-made lake, gilded walls, and towering statues of himself in godlike poses. Nero isn't just an emperor. He's the main character in a performance where everyone else is the supporting cast. And that's the catch. Nero doesn't want to rule an empire, he wants to be adored. So you find yourself attending endless performances, tragedies, comedies, songs, all starring Nero himself. Citizens are encouraged to applaud, and senators sit sweating in togas, clapping like their lives depend on it, because they actually do. Quirky side note. Nero would even lock the theater doors, so no one could leave mid-performance. Imagine being trapped in a 7-hour concert where the artist is your boss and the encore never ends. But his personal stage doesn't stop at theater. You hear whispers about the fate of his mother Agrippina the Younger. She was a formidable woman who helped him climb the throne, but their relationship turned sour. Some say Nero plotted her death with poison, then collapsing ceilings. Then finally, with a collapsible boat designed to dump her into the sea. Agrippina survived the boating accident, swam to shore, and still ended up stabbed by assassins. Historians debate whether Nero orchestrated the elaborate attempts personally or left it to his advisors. But either way, you wouldn't volunteer for family counseling in this household. And then there's his wife drama, which rivals any soap opera. Nero is rumored to have kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage. Disturbing, absolutely. But wait, here comes the stranger detail. Grieving later, he supposedly had a young boy. Sporus castrated and married him, dressing him as Poppaea's replacement. You stand there blinking, wondering if you just stumbled into the world's darkest Shakespearean play. Meanwhile, Rome's citizens, left homeless from the fire, are furious. To shift the blame, Nero turns to a convenient scapegoat, a small sect called the Christians. You creep through nighttime gardens where Christians are tied to stakes and set alight as living torches to illuminate. Nero's parties. It's one of those moments where you shiver, realizing how theatrical cruelty becomes when combined with unchecked power. Yet for all his cruelty, there's a bizarrely human layer. Nero adored the arts, traveled to Greece to compete in Olympic-style games, and performed in chariot races. The twist? He always won, whether he fell out of the chariot or not. You can almost hear the groan of athletes forced to clap as the emperor limps across the finish line, crown already waiting. Eventually, the empire itself can't take the drama anymore. Revolts break out, generals rise, and Nero finds himself deserted. Alone hiding in a villa, he utters the line that supposedly sealed his legacy. "What an artist dies in me." Not what a king, not what a soldier, but artist. You almost want to pat him on the shoulder and say, "Buddy, maybe read the room." The quirky tidbit. Some medieval rumors claim Nero didn't die at all, that he escaped east and would one day return, sparking a whole Nero redivive legend that haunted the empire for centuries. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine imposters popping up, or just the lingering trauma of his reign. So, as you leave the smoky ruins of Rome, one thought clings to you. Nero wasn't remembered for laws or battles, but for turning an empire into his theater. He blurred the line between ruler and performer until the stage itself burned beneath his feet. And as you walk away, the faint sound of a cithara follows you. Notes drifting through the night air like smoke that never quite clears. You find yourself stepping onto the frostbitten streets of late medieval Paris, the kind where cobblestones glint under a gray, hesitant sun. France is teetering under a crown that should inspire confidence, yet here you are, in the presence of a king who makes you question whether sanity is a requirement for royalty. Charles VI, known affectionately at first as the Beloved, greets his subjects with a gentle wave, yet there's an invisible tremor beneath that charm. One day, he's a smiling monarch. The next, he's convinced the very air could shatter him into pieces. Imagine brushing past his throne room. Charles is taken to wearing reinforced garments of metal and padding, certain that even a gentle touch might reduce him to shards. You probably wouldn't survive this if you ever had to navigate royal protocol without accidentally shattering him or worse. Historians still argue whether these glass delusions were a sign of psychosis triggered by stress, or a bizarre courtly affectation that could inspire more terror in those around him. Either way, you inch along the perimeter, careful not to breathe too loudly. And this is only the beginning. France's political landscape is a patchwork of alliances and betrayals, but Charles is caught in a personal tempest. One morning, he reportedly attacked his own advisors with a knife, convinced they were plotting his demise. The Queen and his children wait, trying to maintain normalcy, yet every corner hides shadows of paranoia. You glance at the tapestries lining the hall, now feeling less like decoration and more like potential ambushes. The quirky tidbit? On particularly bad days, Charles would wander the palace dressed as a commoner, mingling with servants and locals as though trying to escape a reality that had become too threatening. Some courtiers saw this as hilarious. Others suspected espionage or sheer madness. You shiver as you imagine the king blending seamlessly into a bustling market, a monarch lost in the crowd, his mind elsewhere. And then there's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether his episodes were purely psychological or exacerbated by the political machinations of the Burgundians and Armagnacs factions within his court, eager to manipulate the king's fragile mind for power. You realize you're watching not just a man, but a chessboard, where the king is both piece and prize. On a more human note, you can't ignore Charles's tender side. During lucid intervals, he is capable of remarkable kindness, gifting artisans and helping rebuild towns. There is an almost heartbreaking contrast between the gentle monarch of memory and the man wandering hallways in panic. It's like seeing a delicate porcelain vase teetering on the edge of a table, fragile and beautiful, yet always at risk of breaking. And yet daily life doesn't pause for his condition. Tax collectors still knock, armies still move, and the court continues its endless intrigue. On days when he appears normal, the king participates in battles, strategizes, and negotiates treaties, only for a sudden breakdown to leave generals confused and citizens anxious. One rumor even claims he would fire arrows at invisible enemies, striking at air itself. You shiver as the wind whistles through the stone walls, wondering if one of those arrows might find a target. The fringe detail. Some chroniclers note that Charles's favorite hobby in his lucid moments was collecting miniature figurines. Staging elaborate reenactments of battles and court scenes, you almost smile at the mental image. The king crouched over a table, tiny knights while the real world outside collapses into factional warfare. By the time you leave the palace gates, you understand that ruling with Charles VI is a constant negotiation between fear, affection, and strategy. France is a kingdom whose fate hinges on a man simultaneously beloved and broken, capable of tender generosity and terrifying delusions. You step back into the streets, noting the contrast between the fragile figure you just observed and the bustling, oblivious city outside. And you can T-shake the memory of a king who believed he could shatter at the touch of a finger. Daily existential crisis you would never want to experience firsthand. You trudge through the snow-swept streets of 16th century Moscow, the cold gnawing at your fingers as you approach the fortified Kremlin. The air smells of pine and smoke, a mix of winter hearths and fear. Because the man who rules here doesn't inspire confidence, he inspires terror. Ivan IV, later called Ivan the Terrible, sits on his throne, a ruler whose paranoia drips like icicles from the spires outside. You probably won't survive a day under him, not unless you've perfected the art of reading moods and hiding your thoughts. The first thing you notice is his unpredictability. Ivan could grant a favor one day and the next execute a favorite boyar because he imagined a slight. Historians still argue whether Ivan's cruelty stemmed from genuine paranoia or a calculated strategy to consolidate power. But as you watch him pace the hallways, the line between rationality and madness blurs. A man with a beard as dark as the night and eyes sharper than any dagger, he radiates authority and menace in equal measure. You hear rumors of his oprichniki, his private force of enforcers dressed in black, riding black horses, wielding brooms and dog heads as symbols of their mission to sweep away treachery. Walking among them feels like stepping into a nightmare circus. Loyal subjects mingle with masked executioners, whose whims dictate life or death. They're not sure whether to tremble or laugh at the absurdity, but discretion wins you. Keep walking, shoulders low. The quirky detail. Ivan reportedly had a fascination with torturing objects to test people's reactions. He once forced a man to eat a live chicken, not because he was hungry, but because he wanted to see whether fear could be controlled, manipulated, and displayed. You shiver, picturing the man, the bird, and the twisted sense of spectacle in the Kremlin courtyard. But there's more than cruelty here. There's a king obsessed with centralization who drives the modernization of Russian bureaucracy and military reform. You notice the paradox. Ivan's terrorizing methods simultaneously strengthen the state. Historians still argue whether his ruthless measures prevented Russia from fracturing further, or whether they left wounds that would fester for generations. You take careful steps around the palace gardens, now empty except for frozen fountains, and consider the duality of this man, visionary reformer or monstrous despot. You pass by the cathedrals and palaces, noting the intricate onion domes dusted with snow, and then hear a sudden roar. Ivan, in a fit of rage, has struck one of his closest allies, perhaps even his son, over a minor disagreement. Accounts differ, some say accidental, some deliberate, but historians still argue the exact circumstances. You flinch as if you might have seen it happen. In quieter moments, the king is reportedly introspective, reading chronicles, corresponding with advisors, and meditating on the divine right that supposedly justifies his actions. But calm is fleeting. A sudden knock at the door, the whisper of a conspirator, and the world shifts from serene to lethal in an instant. You realize survival here is about perception. A wrong look, a misstep, a hesitation can cost you everything. The fringe detail? Ivan allegedly once experimented with crocodile dung sunscreen, a bizarre concoction meant to preserve his youth. Though it probably smelled worse than the Moscow winter, you could almost imagine him smearing the thick paste on his face, confident in its protective power, unaware that his paranoia would age him faster than any chemical could. By nightfall, as torches flicker along frozen walls and shadows dance across the cobblestones, you understand the terrifying allure of Ivan IV. Here is a ruler who inspires awe and fear simultaneously. Minds teeters between brilliance and madness, whose every action ripples through an empire. And as you step away from the Kremlin, snow crunching beneath your feet, the echo of his fury follows you in. I see a reminder that under Ivan's reign, even the simplest day could turn into a living nightmare. You slip into the ornate, candlelit halls of 16th century England. The air heavy with incense, wet wool, and the faint temps of tension. This is the domain of Henry VIII, a king whose appetite for power and marriage makes even the most audacious courtiers nervous. You probably won't survive sitting through one of his courts without witnessing a scandal, a sudden execution, or a proclamation that will append the entire realm. Welcome to a royal soap opera in which the stakes are life, death, and succession. Henry begins as a charming, athletic young king, adored for jousting and music. But as you follow him down the corridor, you notice the obsession that defines his reign: women, religion, and law, frequently in shifting combinations. 6 marriages later, England has a national identity crisis as much as a royal one. Historians still argue whether Henry's break from the Catholic Church was motivated by sincere religious conviction or simply by the inconvenient refusal of one pope to grant an annulment. You shuffle behind the royal retinue, trying to imagine debating theology while worrying you might lose your head. The quirky detail? Henry had a vast collection of hunting dogs, but apparently he loved the birds even more. Some accounts suggest he staged elaborate hawking competitions in the palace gardens, complete with wagers and royal drama, treating feathered prey like celebrity athletes. You try to picture this? A king in velvet chasing a hawk through manicured lawns, while advisors adjust their ruffs nervously. You trudge past the queen's apartments and witness whispered tragedies. An Ulan as delicate frame. Condemned on charges, historians still debate, executed because she failed to produce a male ROR, perhaps because she offended the king. Then Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, dies in childbirth. And the revolving door of wives continues, each replacement a reminder of the king's relentless ambition, his desire to secure his dynasty, and his astonishingly short temper. And there's more than domestic drama. Henry VIII also transforms England's religious landscape, creating the Church of England, confiscating monasteries, and distributing land to loyal nobles. Yet at every turn, you notice the personal touch. Henry's decisions, no matter how political, are infused with ego and emotion. You almost stumble over piles of confiscated relics and manuscripts as you sneak past the newly secularized abbeys, sensing both awe and dread at the scale of change. Fringe tidbit: Henry allegedly kept a personal instrument of torture disguised as a massage chair, which he used more to intimidate courtiers than to relieve his aches. You imagine the jittery advisors pretending relaxation while fearing sudden pain, a peculiar form of stress management. Walking through the Great Hall, you hear the echo of feasts interrupted by proclamations. Bring me my next queen, or execute the traitor. It's impossible to keep track of which edict has precedence, and you realize the court is a living Rube Goldberg machine of loyalty, fear, and whimsy. Historians still argue whether Henry's obsession with succession ultimately strengthened England or destabilized it. Given the religious conflicts he ignited, you step back into the corridors, noting the flickering torchlight that casts long shadows over the tapestry-lined walls. Every shadow seems to whisper the same lesson. In Henry's England, your survival depends on wit, timing, and the ever-shifting whims of a man who is both king and merciless director of his personal drama. By the time you leave, you understand that Henry VIII's reign is a delicate balance of charm, terror, and theatricality. The echo of clanging swords, quills, scratching proclamations, and whispered gossip lingers as you step into the cold night. Realizing that monarchy under Henry is an unpredictable, relentless performance, in you, dear traveler, have just caught the front row seat. You find yourself in the opulent yet strangely unsettling palace of 18th century Denmark, where the walls glint with gilding and the faint scent of perfume mingles with, well, something a little more mischievous. Christian VII, Denmark's king, sits behind a throne that feels more like a stage than a seat of authority. You probably won't survive long here without keeping your head down, because the king's obsession with his own pleasures is only rivaled by the cunning of those around him. Christian is young, charismatic, and yet profoundly unstable. You notice his court flinches when he laughs or cries, because mood swings can turn mild amusement into violent fits of rage. Historians still argue whether Christian's mental illness, likely schizophrenia, or severe bipolar disorder, was exacerbated by the pressures of kingship, whether the courtiers' manipulations amplified his eccentricities. Either way, you inch through candlelit corridors, careful not to draw attention. The quirky detail? Christian had a notorious obsession with personal hygiene and masturbation to the point where his private chambers were constantly monitored. You step past the doors, imagining court physicians awkwardly advising a king while simultaneously attempting to maintain some decorum. The whole thing is absurd, a private struggle turned public spectacle. Yet Christian's reign is defined less by his own actions than by those of his manipulative circle. You spot Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician and de facto ruler, issuing reforms that shock conservative nobles. Struensee introduced freedom of the press, economic changes, and even abolished torture. But his power is entirely dependent on keeping Christian distracted and pliable. You can practically hear the whispers. Do what I say. Nod when necessary. And you might survive another day. Historians still argue whether Struensee's reforms would have endured if Christian had been more stable. And then there's Queen Caroline Matilda, the king's young wife. You notice her quietly navigating the treacherous court, caught between a husband prone to fits and a lover who pulls the strings from the shadows. Rumors fly some whisper of an affair, others hint at political intrigue, but historians still argue the extent of her influence over Christian and the court's power dynamics. You almost feel like a spectator at a tense drama, every gesture loaded with meaning. The palace itself is an eccentric mix of opulence and decay. You wander through long halls lined with gilded mirrors reflecting both the grandeur and the instability of a court that functions like a carnival funhouse. Servants glance at you nervously. The line between amusement and danger here is thin. You watch Christian toss precious objects across a room in a fit of rage, then collapse laughing, as if reality itself is a game. The fringe detail? Some accounts suggest Christian believed he could communicate with animals, especially birds, and would spend hours in the gardens consulting them on state matters. You picture him surrounded by sparrows and pigeons, taking notes as if they're advisors image both charming and absurdly tragic. As you leave the throne room, the atmosphere weighs on you. A kingdom run by a young man whose mind flits between clarity and chaos, guided by those clever enough to manipulate him. You realize survival here isn't about obedience alone. It's about understanding the subtle rhythms of a court that functions less by law and more by fear amusement, and the whims of a king trapped in his own mind. You drift into the misty forests of Bavaria, the scent of pine and damp earth thick in the air, and find yourself at the foot of a fantastical kingdom, unlike any other. Ludwig II, the Swan King, has taken the concept of monarchy and transformed it into a personal fairy tale. You probably won't survive long without becoming utterly enchanted or completely bewildered by his obsessive devotion to art, music, and architectural fantasy. Ludwig begins as a shy, dreamy monarch, captivated by the operas of Richard Wagner. He surrounds himself with lavish music halls, intricate stage sets, and commissions paintings that blur the line between myth and reality. Historians still argue whether Ludwig's obsessive building projects bankrupted Bavaria or were a genius form of cultural patronage that left a lasting legacy. As you trudge up the steep paths to his castles, you feel the tension between fantasy and reality pressing in like a thick fog over the mountains. And the castles, oh, the castles. You first glimpse Neuschwanstein, rising like a snow-white dream from the forest. Inside, chandeliers sparkled like frozen waterfalls. Murals depict Wagnerian legends, and every room seems to be a stage set for an ongoing performance. The quirky detail? Ludwig installed hidden corridors and secret passages so he could wander unseen like a ghostly presence among his own courtiers. You imagine the nobles tiptoeing around, unsure if the king is watching, or simply lost in his own imagination. Yet there's a darker side beneath the glittering turrets. Ludwig's reclusiveness becomes extreme. He avoids politics, leaving ministers and advisors to manage the practicalities of a kingdom he largely ignores. He surrounds himself with loyal confidants who often cater to whims that are expensive, impractical, or downright bizarre. Historians still argue whether his isolation was self-imposed eccentricity or the early signs of mental instability. You feel it in the echoing halls. Grandeur paired with a ghostly emptiness, a kingdom of dreams without governance. And then there's the famous bathing obsession. Ludwig reportedly took hours in elaborate baths, often adorned with luxurious fabrics and scented oils, imagining himself as a mythical hero. The fringe tidbit? He sometimes wore elaborate masks or costumes during private performances, turning his solitude into an elaborate ritual. You shiver with a mix of awe and discomfort, picturing a king wandering his marble halls like a character from a storybook only he could fully inhabit. Even his death carries the air of mystery. You hear whispers as you walk the lake near Bird Castle. Ludwig and his physician were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Historians still argue whether it was suicide, accidental drowning, or foul play. The ambiguity suits the narrative of a life lived partly in a dream world, a kingdom suspended between reality and fantasy. Yet despite the obsession, there is undeniable artistry. Neuschwanstein's turrets inspired Disney castles centuries later, and Ludwig's devotion preserved Germanic legends in visual form. You stand on the balcony, wind biting at your cheeks, and see how the mountains cradle the palace, mist curling like smoke from a candle. It's breathtaking, but tinged with melancholy, the grandeur of imagination, intertwined with the fragility of a mind increasingly detached from the demands of rule. As you descend the forest paths, the echo of Wagner's music seems to linger in the mist, a reminder that Ludwig's reign is defined less by politics than by dreams, obsession, and the seductive pull of beauty. And you can't help but wonder, could any kingdom survive a king who rules entirely in the realm of fantasy? You wander through the glittering halls of mid-20th century Cairo, the scent of perfume and exotic spices hanging heavy in the air, and step into a palace that feels more like a museum of excess than a seat of governance. Farouk, Egypt's last king, lounges in opulence, surrounded by gold vintage cars and the echoing hum of indulgence. You probably won't survive long without feeling both dazzled and horrified by his extravagant lifestyle, monarchy teetering on the edge of ruin, while its ruler feasts without care. Farouk begins as a young, charismatic monarch, adored by the public for his charm and good looks. Yet the charisma masks a growing obsession with luxury and pleasure. Historians still argue whether Farouk's indulgence alone destabilized Egypt, or whether broader political tensions made the kingdom vulnerable to his mismanagement. You navigate corridors lined with priceless artifacts, imagining the king throwing impromptu parties where champagne flows faster than common sense. The quirky detail? Farouk reportedly had a passion for collecting luxury watches, cigars, and racing cars. Some evenings, he would parade his exotic pets around the palace, a leopard here, a cheetah there, forcing courtiers to admire or risk displeasure. You flinch at the thought, imagining the nervous bowing and careful maneuvering required just to survive the spectacle. Yet Farouk's reign is not only a story of opulence. Political unrest simmers outside the palace gates. Corruption, nationalist movements, and economic strain threaten to topple the monarchy. The king responds mostly with indulgence, a disconnect that leaves ministers frustrated and citizens embittered. Historians still argue whether his personal negligence alone triggered the revolution that would depose him in 1952, or whether the forces of modernization were simply unstoppable. Inside the palace, Farouk's eccentricities extend to gambling. Card games and roulette dominate long evenings, sometimes resulting in the loss of massive sums. The fringe detail? He reportedly once wagered his entire palace on a single hand of baccarat, a gamble that could have ended Egypt's monarchy in one unlucky flip. You can almost hear the nervous croupiers and frantic advisors, silently praying for the dice to favor him. And then there's the human side, however rare. Farouk occasionally displayed generosity, such as donating to charities or hosting banquets for the less fortunate, but these moments are overshadowed by his excesses. You wander past balconies overlooking bustling streets, sensing the stark contrast between palace luxury and the daily struggles of ordinary Egyptians. Outside, Cairo hums with life, tensions simmering beneath the vibrant streets. Farouk's image, immortalized in lavish portraits, contrasts sharply with the rising voices demanding change. You note the absurdity of a king so removed from reality, clutching his golden goblets while revolution gathers momentum. By nightfall, the palace's glittering halls seem simultaneously beautiful and suffocating. You step away, the echo of Farouk's laughter and clinking glasses fading into the warm desert air. And you realize that his story is a cautionary one. When a monarch prioritizes indulgence over duty, the very kingdom he rules can crumble beneath the weight of extravagance. The lights of Cairo twinkle like distant stars, as if reminding you that no amount of gold can shield a king from history's judgment.